Were Marc-Andre Fleury's numbers really inflated by bad defense? Plus, what will the Wild's D-core rotation look like? And will the Wild's chemistry really suffer? Turns out it might not. We talk about all of that and more today on Locked on Wild.
You're Locked on Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another episode of Locked on Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen every day. And just as a reminder, Locked on Wild is free and available wherever you listen to podcasts. On today's episode of Locked on Wild, we dive a little deeper and get a Chicago perspective as to if Marc-Andre Fleury's numbers really were his doing or were the result of some bad defense in front of him. We're joined by Jack Bushman for a recap of the trade for Marc-Andre Fleury and a little look at his numbers. We'll also talk about the first look at the Wild's new D-core with Jacob Middleton sliding into the lineup. Who is out, and will this particular player end up being a healthy scratch regularly down the stretch? Plus, it turns out even the most bitter enemies in the division can come together on one team and become best of friends. We'll talk about an interesting wrinkle that may make the Wild's locker room chemistry better than ever, all today here on Locked on Wild. My name is Seth Topal, host of Locked on Wild, your veteran Minnesota sports content producer and captain of Locked on Wild. Happy to be along with you here on a Thursday edition of the show. We've got a couple of episodes coming down the pipe here today. So this will be number one. We've got a special roundtable looking at some of the other moves throughout the East and Western Conference. The Locked on NHL Buyers Roundtable with some of the teams that were the most aggressive at the trade deadline. So that's coming later today. And as for today's episode, as we mentioned, going to be diving into a couple of key elements for this Wild team down the stretch. We'll talk about Marc-Andre Fleury to finish the show today, but did want to start with just an interesting wrinkle to this Wild team. We've talked about the chemistry all season and how that is one of the critical components for this team. A tight-knit group that continues to add to that here down the stretch. And it didn't occur to me that the Wild were adding two rivals to their mix at the trade deadline. They acquired Nic Deslauriers and Jacob Middleton, who played for the Ducks and the Sharks, respectively. Turns out they have had some run-ins over the last couple of years, playing in the Pacific Division, and so it's one of those things where you're like, just like with Marc-Andre Fleury being with the Vegas Golden Knights in that intense series against the Wild in the playoffs last year, you add those players and you're like, are we gonna get sandpaper here? Like, are these elements going to be able to coexist? And acquiring a goalie, what effect is that going to have on the goalies in the room already? Well, turns out we can throw all of that out the window, as we kind of expected we would be able to. Interesting note earlier yesterday for Michael Russo in talking to Nic Deslauriers for his latest podcast. And it turns out when Jacob Middleton was acquired by the Minnesota Wild, the first player to call him to introduce himself and to welcome him to Minnesota and to help show him around, newly acquired Nic Deslauriers. And so even the fiercest of rivals can find some common ground and can come together when there is a deep playoff run, hopefully, on the line. And, the other element of it, too, and this has been reported quite a bit as well, and it led to that unforgettable line from Bill Guerin that there's no room for petty BS on this team. And so when Marc-Andre Fleury was acquired, who was the first member of the Minnesota Wild to reach out and chat with him and welcome him to the team? Cam Talbot. And so this chemistry that the team has built up throughout the year, I think is going to further knit together and weave together with these new acquisitions that are being brought in for the sole purpose of helping to further cultivate this competitive roster and try to make as deep of a playoff run as possible this season. We heard some comments in the game against Vegas, too, from a lot of different players, from Matt Dumba, Jordan Greenway, and others, that they felt invigorated after Bill Guerin made the moves to help give them a little assistance to get back on track and to finish the season strong. Felt like it invigorated them. And so that was one of the things that I was weighing heaviest before the deadline in just looking at if a trade even made sense for this team. Is this something where do you want to upset the balance of what you currently have? And, I'll take the L on that one because these guys, it seems like, are going to fit in just fine. And Deslauriers is already a monster in a good way for this team. And so that can be thrown out the window. And it sounds like Middleton is going to be just fine as well. So we can thank the Wild's clubhouse chemistry that they had already built up for making this process as seamless as possible for some new faces entering the locker room, and they're going to fit in just fine. And so going to be fascinating to see because there are going to be some tough choices that need to be made, especially on defense here over the next couple of weeks. And we'll look at what the first look will be at this new decor, as well as the blueprint for how the goalie starts will go, at least through the weekend. We'll talk about all of that as we continue today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. The NCAA tournament is here, and raise your hand if your bracket is already toast. Yes, my hand is raised because turns out I'm not as good at picking March Madness games as I thought I was. But one spot that can help you be the expert on everything sports betting related is, of course, BetOnline.net. They are the #1 source for all the latest odds, contests, and player props, as well as all of your sports betting needs and info. BetOnline remains the best spot for all of your sports scores, podcasts, and news all season long. And it's not just basketball. BetOnline is your continued source for all of your sports wagering information needs, including live betting and your favorite Vegas casino games. So head to their website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the action. You can find all of it at BetOnline, where the game starts. Continuing today's episode of Locked On Wild, and again, thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen every day. A reminder that we have a bonus episode coming later today for you, which is the Buyers Roundtable for the Locked On NHL branch of the Locked On Podcast Network. All the teams that were the most aggressive buyers at the deadline joining together to answer some key questions about their teams and their respective conferences as well. So make sure to tune in for that coming up later this afternoon, right here on Locked On Wild. So the defense for the Minnesota Wild. Jacob Middleton will get his first action, it would appear, as a member of the Minnesota Wild. And interesting that it is on the top pairing with Mr. Jared Spurgeon, at least according to practice. And so it looks as though the Wild are going to utilize his services right off the bat. And will be very interesting to see how he meshes with Mr. Jared Spurgeon. Michael Russo tweeting out the D pairs look like this: Middleton and Spurgeon, Brodin and Dumba, Merrill and Goligoski, Dmitry Kulikov, the first healthy scratch of this new look defense. Now, I don't anticipate that Dmitry Kulikov is going to be the one scratched every night because this presents an opportunity for the Wild as well. It presents them an opportunity to make sure that nobody on defense gets worn down the stretch, because now you have a seventh perfectly capable NHLer of slotting into the lineup when the need arises. In looking at this lineup as well, this moves Alex Goligoski to a much lesser impacted spot. It gives him an opportunity to not have to play as high intensity of minutes, because it's pretty clear he is starting to kind of run on empty here as we get to this point in the season. So if he can be protected a little bit by being moved down in the lineup, that's a huge win, I think, for this team and for Dean Evison and Bill Guerin. So it would not surprise me if Goligoski gets moved towards more of a third liner, and depending on who's out of the lineup, he ends up swapping with that third line D pair and just turns that into a rotation between those three. Middleton, I think, is good enough to fill in anywhere in the top four, depending on who comes out of the lineup. I think he has a good enough defensive skill set that he's going to be a nice pairing with with either Spurgeon or with Brodin, and is really going to, I think, give this team, like I said, some flexibility to do a few things with this defense. And, as being more of a defense first guy, he can certainly be relied upon to stay home a little bit more and to maybe allow Jared Spurgeon to dip into the offense a little bit and not have to be the one who is covering all the ground and trying to save Jordy Ben. So that I think that experiment is probably over for this Wild D-core. So don't expect to see Dmitry Kulikov as a healthy scratch the entire rest of the season. I think they will move some guys in and out to try to get everybody rested up, especially in the case of lingering injuries and players who are dinged up. I would expect, though, that Middleton will get a very healthy share of starts here down the stretch. So it's a nice addition to the D-core. It's a great addition to the D-core. And so going to be very, very interesting to see how things play out. Now, for the goalie position, it sounds as though it's going to be Cam Talbot tonight against Vancouver. Sounds like Marc-Andre Fleury's Wild debut will be Saturday against the Columbus Blue Jackets. I think that's the right way to go. Now, this has been an issue at points throughout the season where the Wild have leaned a little too heavily on a goalie and have gone maybe one more start than they should have, which leads to a particular player getting shelled and has led to a loss of confidence for those particular players. But in the case of Talbot here, I really don't have an issue with it because of what he has done recently while in the net for this team, and at a critical point with with the goalie position really unsettled for this Wild team, and it seeming like there was no clear-cut option for this team. In the month of March, Talbot is 6-1, and his loss being his first start of the month to Calgary. He allowed 4 goals in that game. The Philly game after that, he allowed 4 goals. And then on the 10th against Detroit, he allowed 5 goals. Even having said that, look at his last 3 starts. 2 goals allowed against Boston, 1 goal allowed against Chicago, a shutout against the Vegas Golden Knights. He also came in relief against Dallas, was scoreless there, and that seemed to be kind of the start that got him back on track. Had a 2 goals allowed performance against the Rangers. All in all, 6-1 in the month of March, a 2.43 goals allowed, goals against average, and a 90.7 save percentage. 1 shutout in that span. 18 goals allowed in the 6 starts, in the 7 starts, and 8 appearances in the month of March. So pretty good, all things considered, for Cam Talbot. And looks as though he's getting closer and closer to getting back on track. And so, you can ride the hot hands. The Wild have not had that luxury here recently with some of the goalie performances they've had. And so if this acquisition of Marc-Andre Fleury is going to push Cam Talbot a little bit to get back on his game, that better suits this team down the stretch, because they're going to need both guys. They can't really lean on one or the other. They're going to need both to be ready to rock, and Fleury will get plenty of time because there are no shortage of games the rest of the way. So he's going to get his. Talbot can certainly take his starts at this point in the season. The Vancouver Canucks on the schedule tonight, and that brings a familiar face back to the XL Energy Center. That, of course, being Bruce Boudreau. The Canucks, after a rough start, are back in the swing of things. 5th in the Pacific Division at the moment, just 2 points behind the Vegas Golden Knights, though, and so they are really starting to climb the ladder, and did the Wild a favor by beating the Colorado Avalanche 3-1. JT Miller did it again, had a goal, and he has 75 points on the season, 25 goals, 50 assists in 62 games. Beyond that, Wild need to keep an eye on Bo Horvat, Elias Pettersson, and Brock Besser as well. And in net for the Canucks, Thatcher Demko having a nice bounce back after a rough start to the season. And so it should be a fun game against the Vancouver Canucks at XL Energy Center. Hopefully the Wild get a chance to further make this an impressive homestand. But we'll have to wait and see what happens here tonight. We will finish today's episode of Locked On Wild again by talking a little bit about Marc-Andre Fleury with Jack Bushman of Locked On Blackhawks to get the full lowdown as to if Fleury's issues were his fault or the Chicago defense. So we will finish things up on today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Welcome to a crossover segment of Locked On Wild and Locked On Blackhawks. Obviously, we've had a lot of trade moves that have happened here over the last 24, 48 hours. The big one for the Minnesota Wild, Marc-Andre Fleury headed to Minnesota to help the Wild in the goalie position. Had to get Jack Bushman here of Locked On Blackhawks to discuss it. So first off, Jack, let's just get your initial reaction to the Fleury move. What did you think of the return? What do you think of the Flower in Minnesota?
Yeah, first reaction was, I know the market for or what the Blackhawks were wanting for Marc-Andre Fleury was a first-round pick, but with him having really all the control over where he wanted to go, and apparently, according to Michael Russo earlier this afternoon, it was a very, very short list of teams that Fleury would be willing to get traded to. So considering that, to get a conditional second, which hopefully will turn into a first. I know Wild fans are hoping that as well, which means they'll be having success in the Stanley Cup playoffs. But I think it was honestly best case scenario for the Chicago Blackhawks, right? Heading into a full-blown rebuild, didn't really make a whole lot of sense to keep on a 37 going on 38-year-old netminder. Even as good as Fleury's been, he's still on top of his game. It just didn't make sense with the direction the Blackhawks were heading in. And honestly, Seth, in the last couple of weeks heading up to the deadline, with so many variables at play with Fleury getting traded, where he'd want to go, then the GM still got to find a way to make it work. I really thought the Blackhawks were going to be stuck with him. So to get a second and fingers crossed a first, I'm pretty happy with that return. I think it was the best case scenario. Blackhawks fans are really going to miss him. He's been phenomenal in Chicago, a great dude, great leader, really the reason we have a majority of our wins here this season. But it had to be done with the direction the team was heading in. So to get that type of return, I think you have to be happy. I think you got to consider it as a win for Kyle Davidson. But as for Fleury in Minnesota, Seth, I just think this move made far too much sense. I've been talking about it on my show for the last couple of weeks. The one place that I really thought would make the most sense for Marc-Andre Fleury would be Minnesota with the recent play of their netminders. They've been kind of on a down stretch here lately. Minnesota's not all that far from Chicago. It wouldn't be, a huge ask for Fleury to move from Chicago to Minnesota. I think it was just the perfect scenario. So I'm glad to see it get done, and I think Fleury's going to help Minnesota a lot. What are you thinking, buddy?
Yeah, I'm right with you, and I've been pretty vocal in opposition of the trade leading up to this point, and so I realize I'm doing a huge 180. But in just talking about some of the things that go into this, for me, I was really trying to figure out, are the Wild's goalies the sole culprit for the numbers that this team was putting up against their opponents? That 2-8 stretch where they were giving up almost 4 goals a game. I wasn't sure if it was a combination of the defense or the goaltending. And on the Chicago side, same thing. Were Fleury's numbers, was that because of poor defense in front of him, or was he starting to regress? But it does seem like Bill Guerin really was confident that Fleury playing with a Wild team with the defense that they have was going to have a much better end to the season. And, you said just to that point that a lot of the issues that Fleury was having this year were because the defense was not great in front of him.
Yeah, I mean, there were times where he's been a bit inconsistent, but with that defense in front of him, he's facing, 30 plus shots per game. More often than not, Fleury was standing on his head and doing a phenomenal job. And as I said earlier, probably the MVP of this team aside from Patrick Kane, but the Blackhawks would not have probably half of their wins without Marc-Andre Fleury. So for a Minnesota fan right now, I would not be worried about Marc-Andre Fleury, his numbers being maybe a little bit down. Remember, he did this with a bad Blackhawks team. So from Minnesota's side, I think it just made too much sense to go and get a guy like Fleury, and you're not going to have to worry about him with that type of defense in front of him, Seth.
Let's just talk a little bit about the rest of the deadline, because Chicago made some moves. The Wild obviously made a ton of moves. Just hit me with your favorite move outside of Fleury that the Blackhawks either did or didn't make.
Yeah, it was kind of a weird deadline day. I expected Dominik Kubalik and Calvin DeHaan, both guys on expiring contracts. DeHaan will be an unrestricted free agent in the summer. Kubalik will be a restricted free agent, but the Blackhawks would have to give him at least a $4 million qualifying offer. So I didn't really understand not moving them, especially when it seemed like a seller's market. General manager Kyle Davidson kind of talked about how they weren't getting the value that they wanted in return. But at the same time, I think both those guys are going to walk in the summer. So that left me scratching my head a little bit, but undoubtedly my favorite move has to be the Brandon Hagel one. And I know Blackhawks fans are going to be a little wary when I say that, because Hagel was a fan favorite here, a guy who gave effort, 100% effort night in and night out, and was really just starting to show us his offensive skill set a little bit more. But with what Tampa Bay was willing to give him, 2 first-round picks and 2 players, and also one of those players being Taylor Radish, who was a former line mate of both Alex DeBrincat and Dylan Strome when they put up video game numbers with the Erie Otters. And in his first 2 games, Radish has looked really good. He had a 2-point game last night, scored his first goal with the Blackhawks. So, I understand the frustration of trading a guy like Brandon Hagel, who could have been a part of this rebuild, but man, I mean, to get that type of haul for him, Kyle Davidson absolutely had to say yes to that. So Brandon Hagel, we're going to miss you, buddy. But at the same time, we're thinking 3 to 5 years down the road. And now we have 2 first-round picks in both 2023 and 2024. Hopefully we'll be getting a first-round pick in 2023 from Minnesota if all goes well for the Wild in the postseason. So that was definitely my favorite move that the Blackhawks made. I just wish Kyle Davidson was a little bit more aggressive with guys like Dominic Kubalik and Calvin DeHaan.
For sure. And, that's the spot where Chicago's at right now, is that, if you're a team that's not in contention playoff wise, you got to assess, who are we really trying to keep, and who are some players that, won't be back. And then you have those situations where somebody comes to you and they say, hey, we'll give you this for this player that maybe is a little further into those rings than somebody else. But yeah, 2 first-round picks.
Absolutely a no-brainer, buddy. But on your end, man, it seems like arguably Minnesota won the deadline more so than anyone else. I mean, you got a feeling good, eh, buddy?
I feel great because one of the biggest issues for this team has been size and physicality. And it seems like going up against other potential playoff teams that the Wild have been pushed around a little bit here over the last couple of weeks. And so what does Bill Guerin do? He goes and gets Nic Deslauriers, who...
What a beauty.
I've attempted to describe what he brings to the ice, and I just have started to go with he has homicidal tendencies on the ice. And I think that's exactly what this team needs, because there's no question that Joel Eriksson Ek line is one of the best, if not the best, defensive lines in hockey. But it only works if all 3 of those guys are on the ice. And Marcus Foligno being, the enforcer for this team, he's been taking more and more penalties, it seems, as things go, because a lot of these playoff teams that you're going up against have been way more physical. And so he's taking penalties, to try to kind of set the tone and get back at people. And so that line has not been on the ice nearly as much as it could have been. And so enter Nic Deslauriers, and he basically flat out said, like, I'm going to be the one sitting in the penalty box.
That was one of the best comments I've ever heard. I was like, oh, Minnesota fans are going to absolutely love this guy. He's like, I'll go in the box. Don't worry. Don't worry about Foligno. I'll take it. That was amazing.
And so he slots into that 4th line with Tyson Jost and with Brandon Duhaime, who is a similar player. Duhaime is not afraid to fight anybody in this league. And so you have those 2 guys, and you have Jost, who is no slouch himself. That all of a sudden becomes a line that is going to get under a lot of teams' skin. And so, yes, they're probably going to spend a lot of time in the box, but you're probably going to pull some other people on other teams in there with you, and or just take them off their game by whatever it is that they do out on the ice. So you get that, and then this Jacob Middleton acquisition for Kaapo Kähkönen completely took me by surprise. But the things that I like, 6'3". We have a lot of under 6 foot defensemen for this Minnesota Wild team. And so Middleton brings size. He brings physicality. He can block shots. He's not afraid to hit people. He, I think right now, would have either the most or second most penalty minutes on the Wild right now. So he's not afraid to mix it up either. And so Bill Guerin very clearly wanted to reestablish this team's identity, similar to what he did when he played. And it's so refreshing to have a GM that is like, hey, we're going to be aggressive. We're going to go get what we need. And yes, maybe would like to see some of those draft picks pan out. But at the end of the day, Bill Guerin is doing what he needs to do for this team in the draft, in free agency, at the trade deadline. He's always looking to improve this roster. And there's no question with what was done at the trade deadline that the Wild are a better team now than they were.
Yeah, it seems like every need that they needed to address, Bill Guerin did that and then some.
Yeah, he had a plan, and it's one thing to have a plan and be like, well, we got outbid by a couple of people for this player or that player. Like the Claude Giroux, would that have been nice? Would that have been a nice acquisition? Yes, but I think the Wild kind of reprioritized as we got closer to the deadline that if they could add some fight, and I think the exact words that Michael Russo used were fight and bite, that they would be a team that could contend with anybody. And they added a ton of that at the deadline.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like they're bolstering up everything they need to make that push. And I know it's probably been a little bit discouraging with the play as of late. I mean, Minnesota was right there at the top of the division for basically the entire of the season up until the last few weeks. But now there's definitely enough to be hopeful for that this is going to get figured out. You know, you got a good leader in Bill Guerin, everything he's done for that organization. You have no reason not to trust him at this point, right? So it's like now it's just kind of all aboard and getting ready to gear up for the most meaningful time of the season. And hey, listen, Seth, us Blackhawks fans, we're going to be right there behind the Minnesota Wild, okay? We need y'all going to the Western Conference Final more than ever. So Blackhawks fans, it's going to be maybe a little bit weird, but we're all aboard the Minnesota Wild train as we start heading into the summer months, buddy.
If we end up going to the Stanley Cup Final, I'd be happy to give up that first round pick and then some. So, you know, we're happy to have you. We're happy to have you on board, and I too am hoping that we take that first rounder and just say, here, thanks for the cup.
It'll be worth it. It'll be worth it at the end.
Absolutely. Well, there you have a little recap of the Marc-Andre Fleury trade. Make sure to follow both Locked on Wild and Locked on Blackhawks wherever you listen to podcasts. That will do it for today's episode of Locked on Wild. Once again, thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen every day. Now that your first listen of the day is done, you can swing over to our bonus episode of Locked on Wild coming later this afternoon for your second listen of the day. Make sure you're following Locked on Wild wherever you listen to podcasts as well as on social media. Stay as up to date as possible as you can on all things Minnesota Wild by following us everywhere we are active throughout the internet. We will keep you as up to date as we can with new episodes dropping Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.